welcome to my living room on the solstice. The story I'm going to share with you tonight is a story that I created. It's unusual in that regard. Most of the stories I tell are pre-existing legends, myths, folk tales, the odd true story. But this is one of the very few stories that I created way back in 2012. And the reason it came about was because I stumbled upon, I hesitate to call it a quote, a statement more, in a book that referred to some of the Celtic beliefs around trees. And this statement in this book said that the Celts believed that the fir tree held all the spirits of the forest amid its branches in winter, being the only tree in the forest that was evergreen. And that really became a seed for a story for me. So the story I'm going to share with you, it brings in lots of different elements and different motifs. And the reason I decided to share it with you live tonight is because I was going to just upload the previous recorded version from 2012. But when I watched it back, I realised that actually it needed a bit of a refresh, because that was a good eight years ago. And so my storytelling, I hopefully believe, has changed a little bit since then. So, without further ado, let's get started. An age ago. You might even say once upon a time. Before there were people. Before there were borders that separated countries. Indeed, in a time before time. The world was ruled over by the great forest. And it should have been a paradise for those trees. Well, I say it should have been. It was. I mean, storms hadn't even been invented yet. There was only a single season. And of course, there were no people trying to cut those trees down. So living a carefree life and living as long as a tree, you need to find time to pass the time. And the trees found that the best way to occupy themselves was through conversation. And they had all kinds of conversation. They spoke over many things. And when you live as long as a tree, those conversations can take decades. It was great. Until one of the trees asked, "What's the most important thing about the great forest?" We don't know which of the trees began that conversation. It started out well enough, at least for the first few years. But as time rolled on, the conversation began to get heated. The conversation became a disagreement. And eventually that disagreement became a full-blown argument. All of the trees were at each other. You had the oak tree claiming that because it lived older than any of the other trees, it therefore had to be the most important thing about the great forest. The beech tree didn't agree with this. Then you had the sycamore, who was picking on the hazel tree. Now the sycamore believed that her bark was smoother and sleeker than any of the other trees, and therefore her bark was far prettier, which automatically, of course, meant that she had to be the most important thing about the great forest. The blackthorn and the whitethorn were arguing over who had the sharpest thorns, and even the sweet, sweet cherry tree was arguing with the horse chestnut over who had the sweetest smelling blossoms. All of the trees were at each other. Well, not all of them. There was one tree that just stood and listened, and that was the fir tree. The fir tree didn't have leaves like all of the other trees. Its leaves were actually needles, tightly bunched needles, and so there were times the fir tree wondered if it really was a tree. It didn't want to get picked on, and so it stayed quiet as the argument grew louder and louder. Eventually, the Creator, Mother Nature, came to hear of this great argument, and she came down to find out what was happening. She walked through the great forest unnoticed as she listened to the larch tree and the willow tree arguing over who had the bendiest branches. She could hear the buckthorn and the rowan tree arguing over berries of all things. The buckthorn said that its berries were juicier, far richer in vitamin C, and the birds loved its berries more, and therefore it had to be the most important thing about the great forest. It was ridiculous. Mother Nature was disgusted. What had happened to bring such division into the great forest? Something would need to be done, but she had no idea what. To find a clue, she began to ask the trees directly. She approached the ash tree. "Excuse me, Ash, can you tell me, what do you think is the most important thing about the great forest?" "I am, of course," he said. "I grow taller and faster than any of these other trees, therefore I am the most important." Is that so? She went on her way. The next tree Mother Nature approached was the silver birch. She asked the same question, "What do you think is the most important thing about the great forest?" And the silver birch said, "I am, of course. Every year the wind carries my seeds far and wide. It is because of I that the forest grows in size every year. Therefore I am the most important thing." Every tree that Mother Nature asked gave her a similar response, some reason why they were the most important thing. And then Mother Nature came to the fir tree. She asked the fir tree the same question, and the fir tree chose not to answer. If truth be told, the fir tree was in shock. It wasn't used to being asked things directly. It was more comfortable just standing there. So to be asked a question directly, to begin with, the fir tree didn't know what to do. So it just stood there, swaying and creaking in the wind, hoping Mother Nature would go away. "Fir tree," she said, "I know you heard me. Tell me, what is the most important thing about the great forest?" And after the fir tree had considered things for a little while longer, it replied, "We all are." "Really?" Why do you say that? Well, look around you. Each of us trees is different, unique in our own way. If you removed any one of these trees, the great forest would not be the same great forest. And so because of that, we are all important. Finally, thought Mother Nature, finally at least one of the trees understands. And then she looked at the fir tree's tightly bunched needles, and it gave her an idea. She left the great forest. She travelled to the northern kingdoms where she had a conversation with the Lord Frost. And together they hatched a plan. After they had agreed what would be done, Mother Nature then rose up into the night sky. And she waited until the sun began to rise. And she reached out her arms, enveloped the sun, and began day by day to pull it lower and lower and lower. As she did so, the sun grew weaker, the days grew shorter, and the nights grew longer. To begin with, the trees were still far too busy arguing with each other. They didn't even notice. But as the sunlight got weaker, the green of their leaves began to fade. Their leaves began to turn yellow, brown, red. And now the trees began to notice something was changing. Still, the days grew shorter, the sunlight weaker, and now the trees began to ask each other if they knew what was happening. But none of them did. As the sun grew weaker, Frost was able to leave his northern kingdoms. He began to walk south towards the great forest. As he did so, a chill wind blew out ahead of him. And as that wind went through the branches and trunks of the great forest, the trees shivered. And as they shivered, their leaves fell to the ground. Now the trees were afraid. As Frost began to enter the great forest, ice and snow began to spread through the forest. Icicles began to form on the branches, and now the trees were terrified. They stood there with bare branches, bare twigs. And then they all noticed that one tree had not lost its leaves. One tree stood there evergreen, protected by its tightly bunched needles. The fir tree. And so seeing the potential shelter that the fir tree could offer, the tree spirits began one by one to abandon their wooden homes of trunk and branch. The tree spirits one by one came to the fir tree, begging to be given refuge. And the fir tree accepted them all. And so by the time the nights were at their longest, the tree spirits were all huddled together in the branches of the fir tree, their arguing long since forgotten. They no longer cared who was more important. Instead, they huddled and shivered together in the cold and dark. And it was now that Mother Nature looked down and smiled. Now they understood how much they needed each other. So she took pity on them. She began to slowly lift the sun day by day, higher and higher into the sky. And as the sun grew stronger and the days warmer, the nights grew shorter, the days longer. Frost realized it was now time for him to return to his northern kingdom. And with frost gone and the warmth of the sun shining down, the ice began to melt. And the tree spirits began to leave the protection of the fir tree, returning to their homes of trunk and branch, and safely inside their wooden homes they tried hard to regrow their leaves. It took a lot of effort, but tiny buds at first began to open, and by the time the sun was back high in the sky where it should have been, the canopy of the great forest was restored. But Mother Nature decided that the trees probably needed reminding on a regular basis that they relied on each other, and so she decided that for half of every year she would dim the sun. And in this way, Mother Nature created the seasons we have today. The age of the great forest passed, and people arrived on the earth. And those first people had no idea of the lesson that Mother Nature had sought to teach the trees. And so their first autumn, their first winter, as they looked around them, it seemed to them as if the world was dying. The sun was fading, the trees were losing their leaves, and now it was the turn of people to be afraid. Those first people also noticed the fir tree as the only tree in the great forest that was still green, and it attracted their curiosity. They began to look inside, and there they saw all the spirits of the trees inside, and they thought, well, this tree must surely be the Lord of Winter then. And so those first people, they began to treat the fir tree as the Lord of Winter, believing the fir tree had the power to bring death to the world or life. So they tried to communicate to the fir tree, to ask it to bring back the sun. They began lighting bonfires to symbolize the sun, and when that didn't work, they began to try and bribe the Lord of Winter. They began to leave gifts of gold, of food. And so, when the winter solstice came and went and the sun began to return, well, those early people thought their prayers had been answered. And so the following year, when it happened again, they lit more bonfires. They gave more gifts of gold and silver. They began to hang candles upon the branches of the fir tree, all as a prayer to bring back the sun. And the ages of man rolled by. And so in the depths of winter, on the longest night, a great festival sprung up, a festival of light in the darkest nights of winter. And that festival has become known by many names. But the traditions came with it. And so we no longer light great bonfires, and we no longer hang candles upon the fir tree. Instead, those have been replaced by fairy lights. And the gifts of gold and silver that were given to the Lord of Winter are now replaced by tinsel and baubles. And indeed, the Lord of Winter is more commonly known now as a Christmas tree. And so, at this solstice time, at the longest night, when the sun is motionless on the horizon for a couple of days before the days will begin to lengthen once more. I hope you will take time to keep your loved ones close, look after yourselves, and as Solstice rolls into Christmas, there is only one thing else I can do, really, isn't there? And that is to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. And thank you for joining me. Goodbye.